Chelsea mentioned, we're continuing in the book of Acts. The book of Acts is the story of how the first church began. Really, it's a story of how we got here. How did the church begin? Where did we come from? One of the things we've mentioned as we began this series is that we don't just simply want this to be a history lesson, but for us, we're rediscovering something about who we are and who we have the opportunity to be today. That's really what this is all about. I know for me, the past several weeks, I've just been reflecting on the idea of this church and how it literally turned the world upside down. It's mind-blowing when you think about this. The church in Jerusalem, after the day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, there were about 3,000 people that were a part of that church. I'll just share this with you today. There'll probably be around 2,000 people that attend Summit today. There's about 3,000 people that attend here on a fairly regular basis. A church that was really essentially the same size as our church right now, gathered in the city of Jerusalem, and within a few short decades had literally changed the world around them. When you think about that, that's not just something we acknowledge in history, but I hope you find that as inspiring. Like for me, I've just been wrestling with this. The last couple of weeks, I've been kind of hoping that Acts would change my perspective of my life and that all of us would be influenced by the perspective we're seeing here. And so I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking like, what if we today began to live with a sense of urgency and purpose that the early church did? What if we began to hear the whisper of Jesus' voice in our ears that it is on us to be proclaimers of the gospel in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and the uttermost parts of the earth? What would it look like if people today began to live their lives aware of God's presence and animated by His Spirit? If we began to move through our days, regular people going to work and jobs just like those people, regular people with families and school just like them, what if we began to move into our culture and our lives with that same sense of fervor? What would happen? I've just been dreaming about this, been looking at this, been thinking like, could this possibly be the case? Like, what would happen in our city if we just began to make this little shift in our thinking? We began to see ourselves the same way they see themselves. What would happen in our county or in our nation? What would we see happen? Could it be said that maybe 10 years from now that this little church in Spokane, Washington turned the world upside down because we started to take Jesus at His word? Like, what if we took responsibility for us being the hope of the gospel going forward the way that they did? That's where my mind has been lately. Kind of heavy, right? Just a little light thinking before you go to bed at night. But this is what this book does. Like, you look at this book and you hear these stories and you go, wait a second, this is telling an alternative story. This is telling a story about how life can be lived that is not like the story that I've been living. And so it causes you to look at things differently. That's what this text does. Now, we're going to dive in this morning and continue on where we've left off. The book of Acts took a shift a couple chapters ago, a couple of weeks ago, when the church at Antioch, this amazing church at Antioch, was in a time of worship and prayer, and they suddenly felt the need to send Paul and Barnabas to a new place. Like, they took this thing seriously, and in a time of worship and prayer, kind of like the time of worship and prayer we've just been having, they were listening for God's leadership, and when they were done worshiping and praying, they were like, Paul and Barnabas, you guys need to go. Like, you need to get out of here and go new places. I found myself last couple of weeks thinking about, like, those two guys during that worship time. Like, they're up on the front row, Paul and Barnabas, hands raised, like, I'll see you do it again, like over and over, like, yes, I love this song, and then like the song ends and they open their eyes and like everybody else in the church is looking at them. You guys, it's time for you to go. Like, it's like grasshopper kung fu moment, right? It is time. You snatch the pebble from our hand. It is time. Some of you aren't old enough to know even what I'm talking about right now. There's an amazing show with a guy named David Carradine, and some of you have missed out on it. But just like that moment, right, without the Kung Fu reference, they go out, right? They send them out. And they send them now on this journey to new regions to tell people about the story of Jesus. Like, there's people that really don't know what Jesus is really all about. And so just sort of a reference point so you have some perspective on what's happening. Just want to show you just a little bit of a map. I think sometimes getting context for these things is really helpful. You'll notice on the far right-hand side over there, there's Antioch with the gold star, and that's really where this church was located. And then the red lines with the arrows, if you're really smart, you realize that's where they went, right? So they took off to Cyprus and Paphos and then up to Asia Minor, to Perga, and then on up to the other Antioch. And then what we're reading about today is the movement to this place, Iconium and Lystra, the area over to the right. I want to show you this map because I think sometimes we can read these stories and it's sort of like a fairy tale. until you look at something like this and you realize, oh no, wait, these are real people who are living in real cities. And last time I recognized that that's actually a map of the real world. That's actually real people going to real places, and it means that they're not that different than us. And so this morning we're continuing on in this journey. We're actually going to come to the conclusion of the first missionary journey of Paul and Barnabas as we do this. They start off in Acts chapter 14. There is just some amazing stuff in here. There are some things that inspire us. There are some things that challenge us. There's something that I've been noticing in the book of Acts, and maybe you've seen this too, that even in this little journey as they go, in certain places, Luke, the author, he sort of summarizes what happens there. He's like, hey, so they showed up at this town, and they went to the synagogue, and they preached the gospel. And some people liked it, and some people didn't. And sometimes people tried to stone Paul and Barnabas, no big deal, just a day in the life of an apostle. And then they went on to the next city. There are these little summaries that he does, but then occasionally he stops, and he tells a bigger story. He'll say, well, but at this city, they went to this place, and when they went and they taught, there was this thing that happened. And here's what I've noticed. Every time Luke extrapolates what took place in a particular city, there's a particular lesson that challenges us where we are today. In Acts chapter 14, there is something like he stops. Instead of just summarizing, he's like, I'm going to tell you a story, and let me just say, this story radically impacts where we are today. I don't say that lightly. I don't say that without understanding the weight of that. This story radically changes our understanding. If you'll notice in chapter 14, it picks up right where chapter 13 left off. Go figure. This is like the Bible kind of makes sense, right? So they're in this place called Iconium. Maybe you saw it on the map. And Luke says, hey, essentially the same thing happened in Iconium. They went to this place and they hung out. The little summary statement. People didn't like them, tried to kill them, so they went to the next place. Tough sales job, right? But then they moved to this new town. And verse 7 says they moved to a town called Lystra. And in Lystra, something happens that is so outlandish. Like, you're going to hear this morning, that finding a category for what's taking place is going to be really difficult for you. For us that are modern, educated, sophisticated people, trying to understand what's happening here on the surface will be very difficult for us. The problem is this, that once you do find a category for understanding what's happening, you realize its absolute relevance to where you and I sit this morning. You're just going to have to see this as you look at this. We're going to start reading in verse 8. They've traveled to Lystra, and then this is what it says. It says, now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, stand upright on your feet. And he sprang up and he began walking. I'll just pause here for just a second. And I want to make note that this type of story has been repeated over and over and over again in the book of Acts. You've probably noticed this time and time again. There was somebody who had some sort of physical ailment, and then they came in contact with the apostles, and the apostles either spoke prophetically or prayed over that person, and then that person was healed, right? So over and over again, we've seen this. Never once in the book of Acts have we seen what happens next. This is the first time, maybe the only time we ever see anything like this in the book of Acts. He gets healed, he begins walking, and then verse 11 says, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. And I know what you're thinking. First of all, what in the world is going on here? And secondly, how in the world could a group of people following Greek mythology have anything to do with us, right? How could this even relate to us in any way? First, a little background so you understand why this is happening. Why does this take place? It's interesting that if you go back into the history or the mythology of the city of Lystra, you'll discover a story. When you start reading about their personal cultural history, there is this story from way back, hundreds of years before this particular moment that we're looking at, and it's a story of an individual and her husband, Bacchus and Philemon. Heck of a name, Bacchus. Philemon's okay, right? At least call him Phil, but Bacchus, like, what do you even call her for short? But Bacchus and Philemon in the mythology of Lystra is this older couple. They live out on the outskirts of the city of Lystra. And one particular evening, as the story goes, two travelers come by their house and stop in for some sort of respite, stop in for some sort of care. They're asking for a place to rest, maybe some food to eat, some wine to drink. And as the story goes, they invite them into the house, and they begin to welcome these visitors, and they talk with them. And as they're talking with them, they begin to notice that there are some unusual events taking place. For example, one of the stories in the myth is this, that they keep continually pouring them wine, and every time they put the jug of wine back on the table, the amount of wine in the jug is exactly the same as when they poured it in the cup. Like, it's the bottomless jug of wine. And they're like, okay, this is really crazy. After a few of these events, they begin imploring these men about who they are, and they reveal themselves as Zeus and Hermes, come in the form of human bodies to this town of Lystra. What's interesting in this mythology is what Zeus and Hermes tell this couple is that they've been moving from all of these places in the town. They've gone from house to house, and they actually tell them, you are the only people who have welcomed the gods into your home. So then they encourage these two people to go up on a nearby hillside. And when they do, Zeus and Hermes unleash a flood onto Lystra, and they flood the village, killing everybody. After this older couple, they build a temple, a place of worship, which is the temple that is outside the gates of Lystra that's being referenced in what we just read. So, that's the background of this story. And then one day, two random visitors come to town, and they perform a miracle. And everyone assumes that they're Zeus and Hermes, right? You better, unless you want to get flooded out of your home, right? You have to believe this, right? I mean, if you grew up, why do they believe this? Why do they think that they're Zeus and Hermes? Well, if you believe in a culture that all of your life has been orally passing down a tradition that says Zeus and Hermes once came in the form of men, and they revealed themselves to only a certain group of people, and they failed them, and they were killed because of it, if you live in that culture and two random strangers show up and perform miracles, you're going to give them the benefit of the doubt, aren't you? Like, I don't really know if they're Zeus and Hermes, but I'm going to go ahead and guess that they are because I don't want to get killed. And so, of course, if you live in that culture, you're going to live out the assumptions based on the mythology that you have created to make sense of the world. See, now you're probably asking, so what does this have to do with us? Every single culture, every culture in humanity, including the culture that you and I now live in. Like, we swim in a pond of culture. We live in a culture. We're not aware of it because we swim in it, we breathe it, but every culture that has ever existed has myths. Every culture has stories that it tells. In our sophistication, we might call them narratives because it doesn't sound as primitive as myth, but we have narratives of how life works. In other words, every single culture tells a story. Every culture tells a story. We have stories from our past. Even in our culture, we have stories from our past that are retold and they're passed on from generation to generation. And we have these narratives of history that become pictures for us of how things are supposed to work, right? And so, like in this example with these people living in this city, the Greek gods and goddesses were a way of framing an understanding of why the moon and the stars and the earth and all the things that happened around them happened the way that they did. Why did events like this take place? They developed a framework, a mythology to explain themselves. This is what we all do. Even in our sophisticated culture, we have stories, we have narratives that make sense of the world around us. We have stories that tell us where to find meaning. We have stories that tell us how to find real life in the middle of life, right? We have stories that tell us where we can find value or purpose. In fact, we judge events that happen in our life. We decide whether or not things are good or whether or not things are bad based on the narrative or the story of our culture. We interpret circumstances. We even allow the story to determine what we dream about, what school we go to, what career we have. All of those sorts of things are determined and shaped by the larger narrative that our culture is telling. For example, let me just give you this one. In our culture, we have the myth of the American dream. It's a mythology. It's a story that we've been telling for generation after generation. And if I asked you to extrapolate on the American dream, most of us, when we hear that phrase, we have stories of examples of the American dream, right? We have a picture in our head. Well, this is what the American dream is all about. And when we start to tell those stories, what you realize is that common among all of us is that we have grown up believing certain things to be true about life and how it works and where to find meaning. And it's based on this thing called the American dream. From generation to generation, we've told stories. The interesting thing about the American dream, let's use this myth as an example. The interesting thing about the American dream is that the longer that story is told, the further and further it is removed from reality, and the more it begins to feel like a myth. For example, today, the American dream has very little to do with hard work and individual responsibility. Have you noticed this? Today, the American dream as a myth is just something we are all entitled to. It is just a type of life, a way that things are supposed to work, a framework that things are supposed to live by, and we're just supposed to get it. If you were to go back 100 years, stand on Ellis Island and welcome the immigrants who were entering into our country and describe the American dream today, they wouldn't be able to recognize it because it's become a myth. And it's shaped our culture, and it's shaped our thinking, and it's shaped our planning, and it's shaped our dreaming. For most of us, this narrative, this cultural myth has been driving our lives, what we value, how we use our time and our energy, the neighborhoods that we live in, the way we decorate and furnish our houses, the kinds of cars that we drive. All of these things are being interpreted and shaped by a cultural narrative that says this is how you and I can make sense of our life. So we're all playing this game. We're all, filling in the blanks. And probably all of us right now having a bit of an existential crisis, right? I know this is heavy, but we need to recognize this. Everything that happens gets matched up to the narrative. Every culture tells a story, just like the one we're reading about here. And every person in that culture is trying to make sense of reality based on that story. So two guys walk into a town, and it must be Zeus and Hermes, because we are slaves to the story. I want you to think about this for a moment. Have you thought about how many of your expectations of God, how many of your expectations about how your life is supposed to be moving, expectations of how things should be working around you, are based on the cultural narrative versus the narrative that God might be telling you? Have you thought about the fact that you're making decisions, even today, tomorrow, this week, that are being shaped by a narrative formed and retold by our culture over and over again? And how do you feel when you begin to realize that you're aligning your life and your values and your mission and your purpose to a myth rather than reality? See, that's the challenge as I read this. I wonder how many times has God walked into my story and I just assumed, oh, this is Zeus and Hermes, right? Like God moves into my story and I'm forcing God to fit the narrative my culture's telling rather than letting God be God and let him tell a different story. How many times have I been blind? How many times have I been disappointed in God? Because I'm a slave to the mythology of my culture. Fascinating book by an author, an Australian named Mark Sayers. He wrote a book called Facing Leviathan about the shifting of our culture. It's a great read. If you want to read it, I recommend it. He says this towards the end. He says, in a culture that is increasingly fragmentary, episodic, and confused, the biblical leader acknowledges a sweeping cosmic drama, a narrative that binds together the universe. There is a larger story that needs to be told to rescue out of the bondage of the mythology of our culture. That, interestingly enough, is exactly what Paul and Barnabas do in the city of Lystra. He breaks them out of the story of their culture. Look what happens in verse 14. It says, when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they tore their garments and they rushed into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is within them, In past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness. For he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Even with these words, though, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. I love this moment when they run into the street and they say, "Why are you doing these things?" It's a good question, right? Do you ever find yourself asking this question? Like, why are we doing these things? I'm just going to be a troublemaker for a moment, but are you thinking that right now? You think about our lives. Do you ever stop and go, why are we doing these things? Why are we caught up in the rat race? Why am I stuck on achieving these goals? Why am I pouring my life into this thing? Why have I set my heart and my hopes on this story? Why are you doing these things? Why do we do this? Then Paul says, in the middle of that tension, we bring you good news. That word good news, that phrase is always connected to a story. We bring you a different kind of story. We bring you good news. We bring you a new kind of story. There's something important for us to recognize in this. The good news that you and I need right now, if you find yourself feeling any sense of tension, the good news that we need rarely comes from within the mythology of our own culture. What you and I are longing for, like this thing that we desire, we're not going to find the answer in this story. That's not where it's going to be found. The good news, just like this story here, the good news that you and I need to hear is going to come from the outside in, and it will penetrate this story that we're living, just like it penetrated this story that we're reading. And it redefines everything. It's an entirely new story. You notice when he asks what they're doing, he goes on to comment and he says, "Why do you do these things?" And here's why he's so puzzled. Once you see the larger story, and this is happening for some of us in this room right now, once you begin to see the larger story and you begin to recognize who God is and the larger beauty of the gospel, you have these moments when you go, do you realize how many things we do don't make sense? That's how Paul's looking at this. He's like, man, I'm living by this other story. And now that I'm listening to, embedded in your story, he's scratching his head like, why do you do these things? And so in the middle of this, he says, turn from these vain things to a living God. Now this phrase is really loaded. When he says turn from these vain things, we need to unpack this. The word that he uses, the Greek word, is the Greek word mateos. The Greek word mateos was used in Greek culture at large. When it was used, it was to reference the emptiness of something, the uselessness of something. If a tool broke, it was mateos. You couldn't use it anymore. If a person looked in a mirror and tried to make a judgment on who they were based on what they saw, it was mateos. It was vanity, right? When I look in a mirror, you look in a mirror, you don't actually see you. You don't learn anything about yourself by looking at yourself in a mirror. It does nothing. A mirror is mateos in telling you anything about yourself, because who you are is something beneath the surface of what can be seen. Mateos says there is this reality on the surface that's sort of fake and artificial, but then there is this deeper reality that is unseen. Mateos recognize the futility of the things on the surface. So it's a common word, not a Bible word. It's just a word people use to say useless, empty. And Paul in this moment has the audacity to apply mateos to something it had never been applied to in Lystra before. Their myth, their narrative, the storyline for all of their lives. He says, do you not see the mateos of your story, the vanity, the emptiness of it? Do you not see that this is empty? See, as is the case with all people everywhere, the people that are living in this city, they're no different than people living today. They acknowledge that there is this deep, vast void inside of their souls. They live every day with the recognition that there is a hollowness to who they are. There is an emptiness about who they are. Interesting thing about human beings is that when we sense this emptiness, that emptiness drives us to fill it. It motivates us to satisfy the thirst, to satisfy the longing or the hunger. And so we chase all sort of things out of this effort to make the emptiness go away. We entertain ourselves. We educate ourselves. We keep ourselves busy. We keep ourselves numb. We do all sorts of things in an attempt to make the emptiness go away. But what the Apostle Paul is saying to this group of people, and it's the same thing he's saying to us, you're chasing your emptiness with emptiness. You're chasing your emptiness with emptiness. You're chasing empty with empty. You're trying to fill this void with nothing. It's like filling it with air. There is no possible way that you could possibly satisfy this. There is no physical thing that you could put in this place that would somehow satisfy the deeper longings of your heart. Do you see the significance of this? As crazy as this story is, as much as we could never identify with anybody saying, Zeus and Hermes have shown up in the room, I don't know about you, but I can identify with this. I can identify with trying to fill emptiness with emptiness. I'm not just saying like, oh man, there's this day back in Brad's life when I used to live that way. I'm talking about this week. If I go through my week, I can sort of pick out, there are moments scattered where I look at who I am and what I'm doing, the things I'm engaging in, and I think, what was I doing there? I'm trying to fill a void. I'm filling emptiness with emptiness. It's like drinking salt water. It never satisfies my thirst. Do you see? Do you understand? Do you comprehend the ways in which you're chasing emptiness with emptiness? And if somebody living in another story were to enter our story, your story, and see you living your life, would they say, why are you doing these things? Right about now, I know all of us want to buy a plane ticket to the Bahamas so we can just sit on a beach, right? Because there's part of our story that says that's good too. It's better than work. But see, you don't fill the void with something physical. You fill the void with something living. Which is why he says, turn from the empty to the living God. Turn to the living God. This word living in the Greek language, the word that he uses, speaks to the vitality of human beings, where you find life, like why dogs and cats and cows and people and plants can actually live and move. There is this thing called vitality. And what Paul says is you need to turn to the God that gives vitality. Give yourself to a story that actually brings you life. Enter into a larger narrative that's being told. It's not that he's simply saying God is alive. It's saying that God gives life. Like you giving yourself to the story is where you will find life. It's not like know the living God so your current story gets better. It's enter into the living God story so that your living gets better. That's the point of this. Live a new sort of life. Fill your lives with him. And as he continues in this, you'll notice he tells the story of this God, and he says, this is a God who's been here all along. You've developed this mythology to try to frame what's happening around you, but do you see that God has been here in your midst? See, there's a bigger story than the story our culture is telling us. And this story is the story that gives me life and meaning and value and purpose. Notice that Paul and Barnabas, they enter into the mythology. They live within this. They reference this. But then they draw them out of it. I want you to recognize that in the middle of your mythology, in the middle of our mythology, God is working. He's moving in the middle of this. We're like living by this other story. We're shaping our lives by these other values. And yet somehow in the middle of this, God enters into our story just like Paul and Barnabas enter into Lystra. And he just pulls back the layers and says, do you see? Can you open your eyes to this? And why does he do this? Because God's really mad at us. No, that was a joke. Some of you have been in church way too long, and not this church, all right? No, God doesn't do this because he's mad at us, right? I mean, why does this story exist? Why did Luke camp out on this? Why didn't he just say, yeah, there was this crazy thing that happened in Lystra, and then they moved on? Why does he tell a story like this? Because we have a God who loves us. And we have a God who understands the ache of existential crisis. We have a God who understands the hole that we need to fill, this void that we experience. He understands our longing for intimacy. He understands our longing for love, our longing for approval. He understands our longing for purpose and meaning and a cause to fight for. He understands that. He understands us so deeply that in his love, he says, there's another story, and I want you in this story. I want you to be captured by it. I want you to be captivated by it. I want you to run with this story. See, the gospel that's brought to the city of Lystra is not a gospel that is just simply a historical event, some sort of theological principle that people believe in, hoping that it'll change their present. It is an entire new narrative that they are now living by. It changes everything for them, and they're being invited into this. The gospel is a new story that's being written about our lives. And somehow our lives become shaped by this story, and we find meaning and purpose. You know, one of the reasons why I believe this church exploded and why the world just grabbed Christianity as fast as they could was because this church wasn't forcing Jesus into the culture. They were forcing culture into Jesus. When Paul stood up, he didn't say, well, Jesus is a lot like Zeus and Hermes. No, he said, no, Jesus is nothing like Zeus and Hermes. I think the reason this church grew is that nobody stood up and said, you can find your best life by following Jesus, and all your dreams will come true. No, you will lose your life when you follow Jesus. And there is truth and beauty and meaning in that. That is the story of Lystra. When we allow this story to become our story, as difficult as that is to comprehend, that's when you and I find life. Amen? Would you stand with me? I want to pray for you this morning. Would you pray with me? Lord, this morning I pray for honesty with ourselves. I pray for every man and woman in this room to be honest with themselves, to be honest about the storyline they're following, the myth that they're listening to. I pray that we'd be honest enough in this room to acknowledge that our disappointments with you are the byproduct of us believing a story that isn't the story you gave us. I pray that you'd make us honest enough to acknowledge that our frustration in life, the disappointment with people around us, our lack of purpose or lack of meaning isn't because you haven't done something for us, but because of our refusal to believe a story other than the story that's being told us. Lord, open our eyes to all these places and all these ways. And give us courage. Give us courage to walk into our own story and say, no, that's not right. That doesn't work. That doesn't satisfy me. Give us courage to wake up in the middle of those moments of dissatisfaction and call those moments for what they are. And help us, Lord, to lean into you. Show us how we live out the gospel. Show us how we become people of purpose and peace in a world that is thirsty and longing for a new story to follow. We love you, Jesus, and we pray all of this in your name. Amen. Let's close by singing together. As is the case every week, if you want to talk with someone, pray with someone, there'll be some folks down front after the service that you can do that with. Next week's going to be a great Sunday. One of my best friends, one of the best communicators in the world, a guy named Keith Jenkins, is going to be with us next week, and we're going to be doing a little tag team thing. Should be interesting. We'll see. We're not quite sure what we're doing yet, but we're doing it. But as you go today, may those of you who have discovered the other story be encouraged. May you be challenged. May you be passionate about following that narrative. And for those of you who have not yet, may your eyes be opened and may your heart receive the story of the gospel. Amen. Love you guys so much. See you next Sunday. See you later.